Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this lunch and learn for the forestry, paper, engineering and construction sectors on the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. I'm Helen Avery, Director of Nature Programmes at the Green Finance Institute. As many of you may know, we host the Secretariat for the TNFD and also the UK National Consultation Group, which I'll be sharing a bit more about later. So the aim of that consultation group is really just to ensure that as many UK corporates as possible are familiar with the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. They know how to engage with the framework. They know how to offer feedback into that framework as it's under development. And they're able to sort of connect with their peers and be able to share learnings with each other. So this session is very informal and it's designed to provide very high-level information to your sectors about the TNFD process so far, what's coming up, including the release of the fourth version of the beta framework. That's the last version as well. And our aim is to continue with follow-up sessions, sort of deep dives with those who are interested in person at the end of April and early May for comments on that beta 4 release. So I'm going to be joined later by Helen Newell. She is Group Head of Biodiversity at Barratt Development. I'm very excited to have her join us. We'll be sharing some of her journey at Barratt into assessing nature-related risk and how they've started engaging with the framework. But before that, we'll also be joined by Andrew Mitchell. He is one of the co-founders of the task force and vice chair of the stewardship group. He's going to be sharing a few words to inspire us as to why this framework is important and it can't be ignored. And then I'll be walking through a short presentation on the TNFD before we invite Helen on and Andrew back, and we'll also be taking questions from you. So please do use the Q&A function. As we'd love to hear from you. So the TNFD, as I said, really is the brainchild of Andrew, and while he does refer to himself as co-founder, it absolutely wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Andrew. So just delighted that he is able to join us today. So Andrew, over to you.
We tend to take nature as a free good, whether it's fish from the sea or forests from Asia or water from UK rivers. It's free. That's a big benefit to all of us, and it leads to a slightly false sense of what things really cost. And we're having to come up to terms with that now as water becomes more scarce, or we get floods and droughts, or we pollute it, or the dependencies on nature that we all have start to become more apparent. And so I thought a number of years ago that what we needed to do was to create a framework that goes beyond carbon and deals with everything else. The TCFD is a brilliant framework for coming to terms with carbon issues, but it doesn't deal with water. It doesn't deal with plastics in the ocean. It doesn't do much with forests and agriculture. So that's why we came up with the idea of a task force on nature-related financial disclosure. The idea being that we would sort of copycat TCFD, use the same kind of approach. So if you are familiar with reporting and disclosure using that kind of a framework, then moving on to the TNFD should not present too many difficulties. You won't necessarily need to hire new teams. You'll probably use the same staff, keep costs down. But what we do realize is that measuring nature is much more difficult than measuring emissions because we don't have a target like 1.5 degrees to aim for. We don't have a currency like a ton of carbon for nature. We don't have numbers for nature. And that has made it extremely difficult to then work with this framework. So a lot of the work that we've done when we set up TNFD was to get help from the financial sector, from academia, from many knowledge providers. We have 40 leading financial institutions and corporations in it. And Helen will be taking you more through that in a moment. We have 900 institutions now in the growing forum for the TNFD. And I do urge you, if you're interested, to join the TNFD forum if you're not already a member, because it's a great way to find out what's going on and to put your own ideas in. And we've been in a huddle for almost a year, in fact, over a year now, getting to grips with the data, metrics, and standards that will be required to create this framework. Helen will tell you, we're not a standard setting organization. It's important to be aware of that. What we are is going to provide a kind of guidebook through this maze of how you can create a risk management framework and a reporting and disclosure framework, which works for nature. And so all of that is coming together now. The next iteration of the framework is coming out on the 28th of March, I beg your pardon, 28th of this month. So you'll get another look at it. So we would really love you to have a look at that framework, put your ideas in. Does it work for you or not? And we need to do this by sector, of course. We're going to hear a bit about construction and forestry today. So it's a very, very challenging thing to do, but I have seen with my own eyes the absolutely appalling rollback of nature that's occurred in my lifetime. When I used to walk through the forests of Borneo, it's green everywhere. I go up high mountains and look out over the forests, and they stretched to the horizon. But in my lifetime, they've been burnt and converted for commodities, beef, soy, paper and pulp. You know these stories. Some of you will be in the forestry sector and all too aware of these issues. And this is something which is really going to undermine the stability of our economies. And we're beginning to see that happen with climate. It will also happen with nature. And it's often the things we can't see, microbes in the soil, tiny plankton in the sea that are affected by either agricultural practices or for instance, microplastics. So we're all coming to terms with this. I'm looking forward to the discussion today, where we can focus in on construction, engineering, forestry and paper. These are sectors that are in the front line of the degradation of nature, as you will know all too well. Perhaps not so obvious in Britain. Remember, we've only got 2% of our natural forests left in this country. We're one of the most depleted countries in the world in terms of biodiversity. Now, that might be a bit of a surprise when you walk through the pleasant English countryside. But if you go to places where it's wild for thousands of miles and you see how different it is in the UK, you begin to realize how we are starting to have that impact elsewhere. So our supply chains are global. We all have to come to terms with that. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. I'd like to hear from you, how you're grappling with these things, what you think about the TNFD. And Helen, I'm going to pass it back to you now to explain what it's all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and look forward to hearing a bit later from you as well in the panel discussion. So we have some slides that we're going to go through, or I'm going to go through now with you, that are just going to explain what the TNFD is, what's the National Consultation Group, so then we're going to have a chat with Helen Newell from Barratt Homes, and then also Andrew will be joining us for that conversation, and then we'll have a wrap up from Louise Heffernan, who's an Associate Director with KPMG. KPMG have been supporting the UK National Consultation Group, so we're very, very grateful to them and to Louise for joining us for a bit later. So if we could have the next slide, please. I know there's always a bit of a delay on the slides, but for those who this is your first time engaging with the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, just a brief bit of background that it launched in October 2021, co-chaired by Elizabeth Morema and David Craig. As Andrew mentioned, there are there's almost 1,000 forum members globally now. And what that means is you sign up to the TNFD forum as an advocate of the TNFD, but also someone who's interested in engaging with the TNFD. There are specific webinars that are run through the TNFD forum, as well as you get notifications on related news, as well as upcoming beta releases. So we do recommend that you join that. It costs you nothing. So you can join that on the TNFD website. And also we have more details on it on our own page on our GFI site. And we'll be sharing that link with you in a minute. You can find out how to join the forum then. There's 40 individual task force members actually designing the framework. And then there's a data catalyst, which includes over 100 nature-related data providers who are working really hard to uncover what is the data that you are going to need as companies in order to be able to disclose your nature-related risks and dependencies. As Andrew mentioned, it's not building a standard, it really is building a framework for companies to be able to disclose those impacts and dependencies. And obviously the aim is that it can support a redirection of those global financial flows away from activities that harm nature and towards activities that benefit nature. have the next slide, please. Thank you. So just some key milestones to go through with you. We've actually had 3 releases so far. The first was in March last year, then in June, and then in November. I'm going to give you some highlights from those beta releases so far, but there's a lot of information available on the tnfd.global site, so you can go and visit those releases there. COP15 was a major milestone for TNFD. In Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework was a commitment by those 196 countries to encourage the reporting of disclosure of nature-related risks, including impacts and both impacts and dependencies, sorry. So we are expecting much bigger take-up of TNFD. There's full support. The ISSB has also come out in support of TNFD. We're talking a bit about some of the partners that TNFD is working with later as well, including science-based targets for nature. And as Andrew mentioned, 28th of March will be the 4th and final beta release. So this really is your last chance to offer your feedback. It's been a really open process. The TNFD has been taking feedback from people all the time. So this is your chance, if you haven't already, to sort of read through that release, digest it for a bit. As I say, we'll be hosting some specific roundtables where you can come and give your feedback, or you can use the portal, which is just very simple on the site itself. You can, the link is up, one that says framework in it. You can actually offer your own feedback directly into the TNFD. The 1st of June will be when that consultation period ends, and then in September, the second half of September this year is when TNFD will be finalised and launched. Obviously, I appreciate it's still going to be an iterative process, but that should be that will be when it really sort of comes into its own and starts to become adopted. So next slide, if we could have it. So what are the pillars of the TNFD and what are their recommendations? Well, in response to really clear calls from market participants for a consistent and integrated approach to sustainability reporting, the TNFD's draft disclosure recommendations explicitly build on those already recommended by the TCFD. So as you'll see here, they follow the TCFD's 4 pillars of disclosure: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. There are also a couple of new requirements within that, as you can see here. I'm not going to linger on these slides. We're going to be sharing them with you afterwards. It's all fully available on the site, but I just wanted to sort of give you a sense of what it is so you can sort of understand what you might want to follow up with and explore further. So we can have the next slide, please. So there is a sector and realm specific information. What that means is that for every sector, there's going to be different guidance offered on how to sort of tackle your own assessments. Specific sector guidance is going to start to be released with this beta framework, with the version 4 out on March 28th. There'll also be other sectoral guidance increasingly coming over the year ahead that, again, will be open to getting your feedback and be iterated upon. Also, this wonderful periodic table is something just to familiarize yourself with. It's a really foundation for understanding nature. This is very new to a lot of companies. So it's a way of sort of looking at how you might look at the ecosystems that you're interacting with or that your supply chain's interacting with. So there's this wonderful periodic table of the different biomes that looks at land and fresh water and ocean and atmosphere. And then we'll linking those sector-specific and realm-specific guidance, you can kind of better understand what your dependencies impacts are, as well as your risks and opportunities. Next slide, please. So we thought we'd just sort of share with you what you probably know already, but just I've got a couple of slides looking at the various sectors that we've grouped together in this webinar. So if you're not familiar with the Encore tool, I think we're going to post the link in the chat in a moment, but it's well worth just taking a look at. It can be a first step for many organisations in starting to understand their nature-related impacts and dependencies. This has helped pull this slide together, for example. So impacts for forestry and construction, for example, might be extraction of raw materials can impact soils. There might be impacts on groundwater. And why is that important? Because there might be construction delays or value loss. if there has been perhaps increased extreme weather events. There could be reputational damage if there is something quite serious that happens to some of those ecosystems that are taking place. We already see through forestry a lot of reputational risk of forestry companies that aren't taking into account biodiversity. In terms of dependencies, again, you will know this better than me, but raw materials in production are used, such as timber and water. And obviously there's a potential of there for risk of increased production costs or lack of viable real estate land. In terms of opportunities, it might be on-site biodiversity net gain, sustainable forestry practices provide an opportunity, recycling of wastewater and chemicals is another opportunity. And in terms of risks, obviously weather is a big one that can result in damage to constructed buildings or supply storehouses. So these are just some of the impacts and dependencies that are coming out of the use of that Encore tool. And if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. This is just an example of upstream, midstream, downstream impacts for the forestry and paper. So as you can see, this again, this is pulled from the Encore tool. Upstream forest cultivation, obviously high risks of flood and storm and dependencies on ground and surface water, dependencies on the weather, dependencies on erosion, stabilization of the soils and climate regulation. Moving further downstream, the end, the recycling and disposal is the main sort of illustrative impacts. And some of those dependencies, again, are going to be well, we don't have the data for those, unfortunately, in this piece. But packaging distribution, it would be bioremediation and dilution by atmosphere. Those are low risks, but still, this just gives you a sampling of what some of the tools that are out there to help you in this early stage as you're starting to look at what might your impacts and dependencies be. We can have the next slide, please. And they're here the same again for construction engineering. Some of the high risks are around dependencies such as groundwater and surface water upstream, and then downstream would be flood and storm protection, water flow maintenance. But we'll send these slides over to you so you can spend more time looking at them, and also you can see the link in the chat if you want to play around with it yourself for your particular sector or subsector. So the next slide talks about what's called the LEAP approach, and this is just to familiarize yourself with the TNFD. The LEAP approach is the approach to helping you with your assessments. So L stands for locate, E for evaluate, A for assess, and P for prepare. So the first piece of this puzzle is obviously locate. That's extremely important for biodiversity. And so it's about locating what your key interfaces are with nature. What is your business footprint? What kind of biomes and ecosystems are you interfacing with? What are the sort of priority locations based on that interaction with those ecosystems? And what are the sectors and business units or the assets that are involved in those priority locations? Then you'll come to evaluate it. Now you understand where you're located and what the ecosystems are. What are your dependencies and impacts on those ecosystems, on nature? And then moving to assess, you want to assess, well, what is the risk and the opportunity of those dependencies and impacts and where they are. And then finally, it'll be about preparing to respond and report on the TNFD recommended disclosures. So it's an approach that's designed to really easily guide any company through how you tackle something that's quite new and feels quite complex initially. So the LEAP approach, you'll hear it often if you're engaging with TNFD, and it's a really helpful way to think about how you're going to start to approach this disclosure framework. So the final slide really I wanted to share was what is the UK National Consultation Group, how you can get involved. So we're essentially, I guess the best way of describing it is a mailing list. So something you have to do to join us other than sign up to the TNFD forum. And you can also just email us directly at tnfdncg@gfi.green. And that means that we'll let you know about webinars, we'll let you know when your sectoral guidance is out, we'll let you know when the beta release is out, when the roundtables will be happening. We'll fill you in with information that might be useful coming out from reports or other studies related to your sector. So it's really just to give you a helping hand. The reason we exist, and there are several national consultation groups around the globe, is just to help you and support you as much as we can in starting to work with the framework. It's not mandated, obviously, but we do anticipate that the framework is on a path to becoming mandated. So the earlier you get involved, the better. And obviously, when you have a chance to offer feedback now, so it's a framework that's designed and works for you, that's what we're really trying to support you with these next couple of months. So more information can be found on the link that's in the chat, Green Finance Institute link. And as I mentioned, you will be notified about a much deeper dive roundtable for your sector, where we'd love to sort of have a bit of a closed door, safe space session in person if we can, even just to sort of work through some of the challenges you might have and some of the feedback that you want. And the TNFD, some of the members of the TNFD staff will be there to also take your questions. So you can email us, but we also will email you. Don't need to be an NCG member to attend, but that's probably how you'll get most of your information from us, is if you do just sign up to essentially our mailing list. So with that, I'd love to now turn to Helen. We always think it's really helpful in these early stage lunch and learns that you hear from people in your industry, and appreciate we've got several sectors here with us today, to understand what they're doing and how they're approaching it. So Helen Newell from Barrett's has very kindly offered to join us, and we appreciate it's very early in the journey for yourself, Helen, as it is for everyone else. So thanks for being brave enough to come on and take some questions. And Andrew's also going to rejoin us just to share some of the international learnings that he's been seeing, and also a view from the task force itself. So Helen, maybe we'll come to you first, and say I do encourage people to post their questions in the Q&A, or you can post it in the chat. I think I probably can see them still in the chat. If you can't get the Q&A app to function. But Helen, I wonder if to start with, and welcome, if you could just sort of share with us, very basically, why has nature become important for Barrett?
Sure. I mean, I can kind of give you a bit of an insight into where we're at in our journey. Just first off, just thank you very much for inviting me to come and join today, both yourself, Helen, and GFI. I think this is, as I was saying to Andrew earlier, a very hot topic, and one that I think we all need to get our heads around quite quickly. And as you pointed out there, I have to admit that as a company, we're still very much at this very early inception stage. I think if I was answering that poll earlier on, I think we're the second one down. We're familiar with the framework, but as an organisation, we've not really begun planning for those disclosures as yet. So I'm conscious that there's going to be others on this call that have been through, I think, a lot of what we're going to be talking about. But I'm really hoping that by hearing where we're at as a company, it really helps others establish their own position and kind of provides that platform for much wider discussion so that we can learn from each other's experiences. We're very much aware of the climate and biodiversity emergency, which is driving a lot of these initiatives that affect our businesses. And I think that the best way for us to meet these different initiatives and to kind of engage with them is through that collaborative approach and kind of knowledge sharing, not just within sectors, but across sectors, also along our supply chains. And we've got to include government and non-government organisations in this process as well. So just to provide a bit of context, I guess, from where we're coming from, at Barrett, kind of since 2018, 2019, we've been really trying to get to grips with what our immediate impact is on biodiversity and the risk to the company relating to the 10% biodiversity net gain requirement that's going to be mandated in England in November 2023. this work has really led us, the work that we went through has led us to embedding a 10% net gain commitment in advance of that national regulatory requirement. So for what that means is that all of our developments that we submit for planning from January of this year has to have identified at least a 10% net gain in that design that they submit. But to get to this stage, it's been quite a long and sometimes quite challenging process getting everyone on board, because what we're essentially trying to do is encourage behavioural change. And the process has involved the whole company, from land and planning teams, technical and construction teams, all the way through to that sales and marketing team, so they can talk to our customers about what we're trying to do on our developments as well. And we've also had to include our external consultants and our contractors in this process. It's essentially a fundamental change to the way that we source land and design our developments, thinking about that direct impact and measuring it, and measuring how we manage that to reduce it as much as possible. And then on top of that, we've also been working with our partners. We've had a partnership arrangement with the RSPB for about 8 or 9 years now. And we're looking at how do we further that requirement? How do we go beyond the biodiversity net gain requirement within our developments? So on that, we've included swift nesting bricks and hedgehog highways across all of our developments. We create wildlife friendly gardens in all of our show homes as well. And we've done this because we've actually found the business case to do so. So it's about thinking much more widely about what's directly impacting us, what's the wider benefits and opportunities of engaging on biodiversity initiatives. And obviously, alongside all of this, my colleagues have been working hard to meet the TCFD requirements. So that's kind of the context from a Barratt perspective, where we are at on this journey. And with regards to the TNFD, we welcome an approach that helps us understand that risk exposure that's associated with nature, that goes beyond our immediate footprint, starting to look much wider along that supply chain. And I think this is the next step along a kind of nature positive journey that a lot of businesses are starting to take now. But similar, I guess, to the net gain process and the TCFD, is that there needs to be an understanding that this next step involves a huge amount of work. There's a lot of unknowns, and it's going to take a while to embed, and it's definitely not going to happen overnight for us. We don't have any historical data on nature and biodiversity, unlike carbon. Therefore, it's going to take time for companies really to understand what the requirements are and to develop meaningful outputs that we can, base decision making on. We've got a lot of small companies who we buy materials from, and I've been informed by my colleagues who have been working on our carbon commitments and carbon reporting that, unlike Scope 3, it's going to be hard to pinpoint where to start our analysis because we've got so little data. However, having said all that, obviously Barratt's in a really good place with this. We're in a good position because we have an in-house team dedicated to biodiversity initiatives, and we've a partnership with the RSPB, and we've been through the TCFD and the biodiversity net gain process as well. It's really smaller companies that are going to struggle to find the resources to carry this out, and potentially this is where your much more collaborative approach is going to be necessary to deliver on this. For example, companies with similar supply chains potentially need to collaborate to do the work on risk mapping, especially where there's an obvious overlap on raw material sourcing. So how we go about establishing that collaboration to make data and analysis available to all is going to be really interesting, I think. But within the UK construction sector, I think this is just another step change that will need to be carefully planned and embedded so that we can leverage those meaningful results. Because only when we start, getting results that are meaningful, not just another tick box exercise, can we make sure that those decisions are going to be good for business and nature as well.
Thanks, Helen. So what I'm hearing is, there's obviously been a movement already around biodiversity. We have biodiversity net gain coming in. We've been working with RSPB, and obviously the mood coming out of UK government is very much towards not just net zero and low emission, but also nature positive. There's development of nature markets, for example. Sustainable forestry is getting more airtime, and what that means in terms of, is it sustainable? Is it biodiversity? Is it also good for biodiversity, or is it just meeting sustainability standards. So there is sort of this mood music, if you want to use that term, around biodiversity. So this feels like a natural progression for companies. I mean, just to be very candid in this conversation, the uptake from UK corporates has been quite slow around getting involved with the TNFD. It's wonderful to see more than 50 participants here in this call. And I know we had almost 100 sign up, which is fantastic from these sectors. And we have noticed that at these sectoral webinars that we have been getting those kinds of numbers, then actually trying to find those who are willing to pilot the TNFD or start testing it has been a bit trickier. So that's also a journey that we were hoping to help UK corporates move forward on over these few months. I just wondered, from your perspective, sort of what are your tips on where to start? Have you used the Encore tool? Is that are there tools that you have started looking at? Are you engaging consultants, for example?
So I guess just to maybe reflect a little bit on where UK companies, especially from the construction industry, are at the moment. Everybody is very much gearing up to meet the biodiversity net gain requirement. There's been a huge, as I was mentioning, there's a lot of work required to change processes within businesses to be able to meet that. And I think that's quite pressing, obviously, with the November deadline happening. That based in England, obviously, but that has been a huge area of discussion for the past year. So potentially, once people are much more comfortable along that journey, they can start addressing some of these wider impacts. It's definitely the next stage for us, and I think that's where a lot of other companies are going. In terms of where to start, I think one of the most important things is really getting to grips with what the business case for managing biodiversity is for your business. So where are those financial, operational, potentially, publicity kind of points of leverage that will that makes sense to your business? And I think the Encore tool, that's essentially what that's trying to do. We haven't used that one to date, but really getting to grips with what the business case for engaging on biodiversity is for your business. And then once you've got that, embedding it in process, embedding it in the company, making sure that everybody is aware of what those, how important biodiversity is to your company. Because only by doing that are you going to be able to kind of find the leverage, the motivation to go further, not just think about biodiversity as a side subject, but actually integrating it into your business decision making. Without that business case, it's very difficult to start on that journey. And the other thing I think which especially for companies that are new to this subject, but meeting up with like-minded companies, companies within the same sector who are probably just starting out in this journey as well is really important. So joining organisations such as the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum is a really, really helpful organisation to provide discussions around these points and to learn from each other as well. I think the other thing really just in this is don't let good get in the way of perfect. I think that's the old saying. Just some of that low-hanging fruit is always a good place to start until you can build up the momentum internally.
Brilliant, thank you. I was just thinking about the UK Business Biodiversity Forum, and then was just quickly trying to find a link and realised I've got the wrong link. So Amy, please post.
I can share it later if you like.
Yeah, that would be great. Otherwise, I might have been sharing the bodybuilders forum, as I've just said, which is not what we're going for. So, well, thanks for that. Thank you for that. We'll come back to you in a moment. But Andrew, I wonder if we could just invite you to share some of your reflections on some of the work that you've been seeing happening over the development of the framework so far. And I know you've got sort of interesting thoughts about sort of the opportunities actually that we often don't discuss here in these lunch and learns.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to hear what you had to say, Helen, too, about the construction industry here in the UK, and wonderful to hear you have a whole biodiversity team, which is not surprising because, of course, you try to build green space around the homes, and making that really successful for wildlife is so hugely important. and that we could have an interesting discussion about how one going forward, the ratios between green space and housing space is always an interesting debate. But let's move on to a slightly different thing, which is linear infrastructure. I think is quite interesting too, because certainly in our own country, we've heard a lot about HS2 driving a massive railway through our small country and taking out some of our ancient woodland. And remember what I said earlier, we only have about 2% of our country as actually designated ancient woodland. It's a very, very precious commodity, and you can't just rebuild it. And linear infrastructure is sort of sometimes a little bit overlooked, I think. So what we, things like railways and roads, and they really carve up the countryside. Though if wildlife, it's extremely difficult for creatures, if you think about it, to get across a railway line. You talked about hedgehogs, it's not a place they want to go. It's open, they can get easily, not hedgehogs, but wildlife is extremely endangered by these open spaces and motorways. So what you're actually doing is carving up our countryside into ever smaller units. And we do very little mitigation for that in Britain. I don't know, maybe we perhaps do with motorways and having underpasses and things for wildlife. It's pretty expensive, but if you go to a place like India, for instance, because remember, TNFD is a global thing, and I know many of you will have supply chains that go far beyond the coasts of the United Kingdom. But you go to somewhere like India, well, they're building a tremendous number of large cities in India to cope with population and creating new commercial centers. These have to be connected by roads and rail. And again, we come back to this carving up the countryside problem. Well, they've got much bigger animals there than we have. They've got elephants and tigers that are extremely badly affected by this carving up of the countryside. And so how do you mitigate that? Well, it comes down to some of these things are going right through national parks as well. So it creates a tremendous hullabaloo. So one of the things for the industry is to say, well, how can we mitigate the impact? How can we allow animals, and tigers are frequently being killed by traffic. The more traffic, the more tiger deaths, elephants as well. You don't want to run into an elephant at night in a car. And so what they'd be looking at is overpasses and underpasses. Can you create, and that's a pretty big tunnel. It's not that big for a tiger, but for a herd of elephants, that's a really big tunnel underneath your motorway or your railway. And if you want to build one over the top of one of those structures, you're building something that looks a bit like a meadow with trees on it. I don't know, some of you in the construction industry may have seen these, but they're big, wide spaces that I've seen some of them, trees and plants grow over them, and animals, if you plant it up right, they use them. They use them. Ancient migration routes that they've known for generations will be reused, and it can really work. But the problem is cost. Who's going to pick up that cost? And as you said, it's all part of this business case, isn't it? Well, if you're constructing a motorway or railway, you don't want to pay those costs. You just want to maximize that. So how can you do it? And this has led us to think of innovative financing instruments, because as I say, working with the finance sector in the world of impact investment. And the idea is to create bond mechanisms that might be used in order to pay for that construction. So you create a kind of green bond, which is associated with the construction industry that wants to build the railway or the road. You might even, if it's a toll motorway or if it's a rail ticket thing, you can take some levy on the prices to help pay a coupon on the bond. And we are now actively looking at such a bond with the World Bank. And this is being organized by the United Nations Development Programme. I call it the Big Cat Bond. And the idea is to create a bond that would pay for these conservation costs. And also looking at, and these bonds are also being looked at in tiger landscapes in places like Cambodia, Vietnam, and other countries in Asia, where you're trying to create tiger landscapes, which and create a bond mechanism that can pay for the conservation measures. But how do you pay back investors? And they're looking not so much at a levy on use, but they're looking at things like carbon credits that might come from the biodiversity landscapes, or ecotourism places that would be built to enjoy what's there in terms of wildlife, and a levy on that could help pay back investors. So what I'm really saying is that when we think about nature, don't always just think of it as a risk, but see it as an opportunity, because there are all kinds of new products that are coming out of this. When you think what happened with climate, you got a massive explosion in renewable energy, and the downside was more on fossil fuels, but it spawned a search for new energy. And I think this will happen in the nature space, possibly in a revolution in the food sector. So this is going to think about how farmers work at the front line, but also how you create new kinds of infrastructure, such as vertical farming units, and repurposing housing or office blocks as vertical farming units in cities, where you can create food under controlled conditions right in the city without having to import it from around the world. And beyond that, to engineering and biofermentation projects, which are now creating all kinds of food products, say from a soup of fungal matter, which is, it's just incredible how this new technology is coming along. So when you think about this in the construction industry, in the housing and in engineering, and of course in forestry, paper and pulp, it's not all about risk management. There are actually going to be enormous opportunities for investment coming down the pipe too, as we reimagine our relationship with nature.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a really good reminder. Actually, we had, and the recordings are available if you wanted to watch them, those who are joining for lunch. We had a session last week with the textiles and apparel industry, where a gentleman, Philip from HiQ, which is a Swiss textiles company, joined us to talk about the types of different seaweed that they were now using for instead of cotton, which can come with its own biodiversity problems. So all the different types of new emerging materials that are biodiversity friendly, but also and providing a real investment opportunity are coming. It's hard to imagine these sweeping tunnels and bridges here to just ferry across a few badgers. Sadly, that is where we've ended up in the UK. We've got a few foxes, badgers, and a couple of hedgehogs, and not much else. But who knows? We're down the line. We've got beavers coming, and maybe lynxes as well. So we could get back there. But it is, I think, interesting to think about how some of the impacts on maybe sustainability linked loans that are connected to biodiversity KPIs and things like that. So thanks for Andrew for sort of mentioning the opportunities there. Helen, any reflections from you before we sort of start to sort of wrap up today?
Just building on that opportunities point again, I think you're absolutely correct, Andrew. I think too often we see biodiversity as another thing we have to deal with, rather than thinking about, well, if we really engage on this, how does it change what we do as a business? How does it set us aside from competitors? And I think also the way that we've looked at it, at the biodiversity net gain process especially, it's really helped drive our landscaping process in a different way. It's really starting to put a lot more emphasis and focus on placemaking, and how that process can really benefit our developments. We have one of our flagship developments called Kingsbrook in Aylesbury, and it's a real fantastic demonstration of when you get this right, how amazing our developments can be, and not just for the people that live there from a health and well-being perspective, but actually for biodiversity that uses those developments. So we've had a massive increase in house sparrows in Kingsbrook. I know, just a small brown bird, but still on the red list, and yet we've managed to bump up that population by thousands of % in that one development. So really, trying to capitalize on the opportunities is a real business driver as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that sounds great. I'm all for more sparrows. I couldn't believe it. I moved back to England from the US and not a sparrow to be seen where I live in London, whereas in New York it was full of sparrows, which is quite sad. So that sounds wonderful. So just a reminder to those listening, the ways to get involved in TNFD, please do join the TNFD forum. It really just is as simple as filling in a form. Nothing more is required of you. Or you can just email us at tnfdncg@gfi.green. We'll put that in the chat. If you want to join the UK National Consultation Group, it just means you'll get mailing of different events, I say these more specific roundtables, or we'll actually start to drill down into, okay, what does it look like if you're going to start piloting and looking to report, and what are some of the challenges, and how do you feel about that Beta 4 framework? Does it work for you? Does it work for your sector? These are questions we really want to know from you. So please, our door is always open. Please do email us. I think with that, I'll just maybe hand it over to Louise from KPMG. I don't know if you had any closing remarks, Louise, that you wanted to share.
Yeah, no, thanks, Helen. That was great, and really helpful to hear the specific context for the construction sector, forestry sector and engineering, and hopefully there'll be lots of questions coming our way. Just from listening to Helen and Andrew and yourself, 5 brief things kind of jumped out of me, unpacking what can sometimes be seen as a complex agenda. So first was that there is a lot of talk around nature and biodiversity. And as Helen said, a lot of people now are accepting the drivers of this. We accept that there's a biodiversity crisis here in the UK and globally, and this is creating a lot of initiatives. So really the writing is on the wall, this is happening, and what do we need to do to kind of stay ahead of that? Secondly was collaboration, and I'm so glad that Helen mentioned that word about 7 times. I was kind of writing down what are the key themes coming up, and collaboration was absolutely it. And I've heard it from so many different stakeholders in the past couple of years, whether it's regulators, whether it's governments, whether it's consultancies or businesses themselves. There is a real urge to kind of remove any barriers from talking to your peers, from talking to other stakeholders about what this means, and really start to collaborate on what are the barriers that you're facing and how can we approach these together. And as Helen said, that could be through sharing data, sharing information, sharing resources. It could be thinking about what other initiatives are out there, and there are so many to help kind of jumpstart your journey. So really kind of being aware that you're not alone in this. It's quite a big topic, but there is a lot of support there, and collaborating with others will be really helpful. The third one, and it was always going to be there, and I think will be, is data and the importance of data. I think globally in every issue at the moment, we are all so keen to understand as much as we can about every issue, about every risk that might impact our investment, whether it's related to biodiversity or not. And to do that, we need the most up-to-date information. And so I think there's a real opportunity here that I've heard today, that through TNFD and through a lot of the things that are happening, more data will be produced. We're getting to the point that that's happening, but also there may be some barriers there. But the key phrase that's always raised is don't let perfect be the enemy of their good. And that kind of brings me on to the fourth point, which is we're not starting from zero. There is a lot that has been done already, and Helen has already spoke to that. That's building a lot of this data, that's building a lot of the information, and particularly for this sector, interacting with nature and biodiversity isn't new. This is something that you guys have been doing for a very long time. So thinking about where that data information already sits to help on that journey is great. And I think hearing from Helen in terms of how biodiversity net gain as a regulation that is coming into place has really driven some of this thinking and has allowed that to be the kind of first step in this journey about thinking about the business's interaction with nature and where those opportunities lie is really reassuring. And finally, which I thought was a really kind of helpful point, is the proof is in the pudding. That business transformation, that business case really needs to be there to bring your whole business on board. It's about a transformation, whether or not it's related to staff transformation or resource transformation or budget transformation. There is something that within your business that needs to change, and to do that you really need to be able to build the argument for why this is important. What risks might you be able to avoid from engaging with the TNFD and testing it, and what opportunities might you be missing that you haven't been able to locate that the TNFD will help you identify. And it was really great to hear, Helen, when you were talking about the work that you guys have been doing on biodiversity net gain and with the RSPB to go beyond the 10%, that just doing those steps initially has already started to build the business case internally, and they worked, and there has been recognition for that internally. So kind of doing these actions and bringing others along with you, I think is key in that. But yeah, they were the key thoughts, and we'll make sure we summarize them for everyone to have a look at.
Yeah, thank you. So everyone, just so everyone knows, if you attended today, or even if you just signed up, you'll get a one pager, it might be two, we don't know, of just how to engage and some key questions for each of your sectors as well, and with a list of some of the tools that are starting to be used. Andrew, just remind us how many metrics is it that you've identified through TNFD? Oh, you're muted, sorry.
There we go. Yeah, we identified about 3,000 metrics out there in the biodiversity space, and I think 127 different tools. So don't worry, we're going to sort it out, work out what's best, what sector, and it'll all come out in the TNFD. So that'll be your pathway through all this, I hope.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so we'll put some of those tools down. Obviously, you've seen Encore today, and KPMG are helping us do that. So you'll have all that. Otherwise, a quiet group, busy eating sandwiches, I imagine. Hopefully not that fungal soup that you were talking about, Andrew, this lunchtime. So, but we'll certainly try and give you as much information as we can in those couple of 1-2 pages that you get back. And again, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for your interest if you've joined us today over your lunch period. We hope to see you again and in these deeper dives in late April and May. Helen, thanks so much for coming on and sharing with us your journey. It's so helpful, I think, for people to just see that work is happening and that you can make the business case for it. And Andrew, as ever, thank you so much for your inspiration and all the work that you've done on TNFD and for joining us today. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.